All right, I'm Scott, and I am here with some ancien prof, Professor Ibrahima Seck. So that's just up on
11 years. Yeah.
11, yeah.
The last time I saw you was in Senegal. So you were involved in that study abroad program with CIE. Yeah, I remember that very well. And earlier I did show you the list of all the students who had enrolled in that class, in that program in Senegal in 2007. And I taught that class on Senegambia in the Atlantic slave trade, which I completed with diaspora studies. I think I taught you something about Africans in Louisiana. Mm-hmm. Just to let you know that the history of slavery is not only a history of deportation and hard labor. We have also to think how these people, beside building the economy of this country, they also contributed to shaping American culture and defining American identity. Yes. I think the class started with Senegambia in the Atlantic slave trade, how the Europeans, the Portuguese who came first, were able to tap into a pre-existing slave trade, I mean the trans-Saharan slave trade, which linked the Senegal and the Niger rivers, all those countries, to North Africa and beyond to more Spain and the Near East and the Middle East and beyond. So the Portuguese did not just tap into a pre-existing trade, the Europeans did not just tap into a pre-existing trade, slave trade, especially after the discovery of the Western Hemisphere of the American continent. This time millions of people were needed to develop the land in the Western Hemisphere, mostly tropical land. And Africa happened to be the most ready source of slave labor. And of course, the Europeans did try to develop the land in the Western Hemisphere with their own deportees, their own poor people. But as you know, you cannot do that to your own people and expect to have peace. And it was a great source of destabilization. But someone had to pay the price of the wealth of Europe. Someone had to pay the price of the stability of Europe. So that's how Africa became the source of slave labor for Europeans. If you add the skills into it, you know, it gives you another explanation or another good answer to the question why African skills were badly needed here. We are sitting here in Louisiana, where many colonists, mostly French, who initiated this colony in 1699, many of them starved to death, and they needed a crop that could grow in the water. And what was it? Rice. The French didn't know and still don't know anything about rice cultivation. So it was Africans who were selected from mostly what we call southern Senegambia and who developed rice cultivation here. Others were cattle raisers like the Fulbe in West Africa. And all of those guys who were deported from Africa knew something about indigo. And indigo became the cash crop of Louisiana in the 18th century. And of course, the slave trade lasted many centuries. From the arrival of the Portuguese in the 15th century to the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade in the 19th century, it's about 400 years. And millions of people were deported. And of course, that takes us into the numbers game.
Yeah,
The numbers game is just like a controversy about how many Africans were deported. Some say like less than 10 million, like Philip Curtin. Others say maybe 12, 13 million. But what it shows is that we will never know. Millions of Africans were deported and enslaved in the Western Hemisphere. But I think people usually agree about 12, 13 millions. And scholars like W.E.B. Du Bois also always advocated that we have to know that for every African who was deported, at least 5 were killed in the process of the making of those enslaved people. From the wars in Africa in which the European companies invested, they invested into violence because they understood that the best way to make thousands and millions of captives was to invest into warfare, permanent warfare. So from those wars in Africa, or the militias initiated and controlled by the elite, who went to the village to kidnap people. Many people died also in that kind of process. The people who died while being walked from the interior of Africa to the coast, where they have those castles, those dungeons, all along the coast, like Saint Louis, Senegal, Gorée Island, Elmina Castle, Cape Coast Castle in Ghana, all the way to Congo, Angola, and of course the Bight of Benin, like Ouida. Many died while waiting those ships. Many died of starvation, of diseases, and you know, with that permanent warfare on the soil of Africa, especially in the 18th century, it generated food shortage because of security matters. You know, most of the fields were abandoned. People went to live into forested areas, mountains, and things like that. And if you add to that natural disasters like drought and locust invasion, they had many cases of famine in the 18th century. And those captives died massively on the coast while waiting for ships. We have also to mention those who died during the Middle Passage and those who died shortly after arrival here in the Western Hemisphere. So I think W.E.B. Du Bois is correct for every African who was enslaved here, at least 5 died in the process. That takes us to a loss of more than 60 million people. Yeah. So that's what we call the numbers game, that controversy about how many Africans were deported over here.
Yeah.
But Africans resisted to all of this. Resistance were permanent. The elites were deeply involved in the Atlantic slave trade. The elites are those people who are in power. Kings, queens, and princesses. Because they wanted those commodities that brought to them by the Europeans. All kind of clothing and commodities like, let's say, beads and alcohol that was used in negotiations.
I also remember there was like a kind of gum from a tree that we had in class.
Yeah, the Europeans bought gum arabic. They also bought beeswax.
Oh, okay.
You know, with gum arabic, gum arabic was used in the textile industry. Beeswax is also important. You can make candles, but also you can make the designs on a fabric with that beeswax. They bought gold. They bought all kind of things in Africa too. So they sold to Africans iron for better quality. and also firearms. And the main explanation of the involvement of the elite is all the firearms.
Yeah.
It became, those tools were badly needed for every member of the elite to defend your own throne and to defend your own people. Some said no to the Atlantic slave trade. Maybe the most famous among them was the Queen Nzinga of Banza, Congo. She said no to the Atlantic slave trade for many, many years. She resisted, but she ended up selling prisoners of war for firearms.
Okay.
It was something to which these people could not really say no. You say no, you die anyway.
Right. Oh.
So the Atlantic slave trade was a very violent kind of trade, and people resisted. Beyond the elite, we have also, especially when you consider Senegambia,
yeah,
we have a tradition of resistance from the Marabout. The Marabout al-Murabitun, that's the name in Arabic. Those are the Muslim clerics who came with the trans-Saharan slave trade since its beginning, and who developed scholarship in Senegambia. So those Marabout were deeply involved in resistance. Maybe the most famous case was Nasradin in the 1600s. I think he died in 1670, around that time. But he fought against all these rulers in Senegambia. And his movement was so powerful. Of course, they were fighting against the Atlantic slave trade, which was really devastating for the populations, all the population of Senegambia. So they were able to dethrone at least maybe 2 to 4 kings: the king of Walo, the king of Fuuta, the king of Jolof, I think, and the king of Kajor. But those companies were so powerful, they invested in defeating Nasradin.
Wow.
With their monies, with firearms. So the elite was able to fight back against the Muslim clerics, against the followers of Nasradin, and Nasradin was finally defeated. But resistance did not stop there. People kept resisting. That's when many went to hide into forested areas, mountains, islands. There's one island off the coast of Sin, the kingdom of Sin. It is called Fajuj. Fajuj was an island where people went to hide in order to escape from the slave traders. I think that most of those islands in Salum also were populated by people who fled the rich plains of the inland. To go on those islands and resist, and many people fled to Casamance. That's a forested area, south of Senegambia. And in the 18th century, you have many examples of people of Muslim clerics also who finally were able to achieve revolutions. Overthrowing the former rulers. In Senegambia, we call them Ceddo. The Ceddo rulers. Those are people who, most of them were not really deep into the Muslim religion, mostly holding to traditional religion, and who had the reputation to be very violent. So I think the first example of a revolution, or Muslim revolution, that succeeded was in Fuuta Jalon, 1725, I think. When the Almami, the Imams, they call them they call themselves Imams, Almami, took the power in Fuuta Jalon in the south of Senegambia. In 1776, exactly the year you started you did your Declaration of Independence here in the United States. That same year, Muslim clerics in Senegambia in Fuuta Toro under the leadership of Thierno Suleiman Baal, Abdel Kader Khan took the power from the Ceddo, the Deniyanke, the dynasty, the Ceddo dynasty, very famous dynasty, who ruled Fuuta Toro, my country, along the Senegal River from 1512, I think, until their downfall in 1776.
Oh.
And those Muslim clerics started a constitution. It was just 11 points. But until today, it is those 11 points are really good references for good governance. And
wow.
People, until today, talk about it and advocate every country over there in Senegambia to follow the examples of these Muslim clerics.
Huh.
But you know what? Even before the revolution in Fuuta Toro, a Muslim cleric called Malick Sy, Hadj Malick Sy,
right,
took the power in Imam Malick Sy took the power in Bundu. Bundu is a transition area, a kingdom between Senegal and Mali.
Okay.
Yeah, along the Falémé River. Falémé is a tributary of the Senegal River. So they took power in the late 17th century.
Okay.
So from Nasradin to the revolutionaries who took the power in Fuuta Toro, there is a continuity. And even after that, until today, the same tradition continues. Those Muslim clerics, they also fought against the colonization. When the Europeans decided to say, now we stop the Atlantic slave trade, and what they did to conquer Africa, and Africans became slaves on their own land. So those Muslim clerics also kept fighting against colonization, and of course there were also the traditional rulers who fought against colonization. Both Muslim clerics and traditional rulers fought against colonization, the colonial conquest. Maybe among the most famous, we have El Hadj Martal of Senegal. We have Maba Diakhou also of Senegal. We have Fodé Kaba Doumbia of Casamance, Senegal, and many others. And we have traditional rulers like Lat Dior Ngoné Latyr Diop of Kajoor, Alboury Ndiaye of Jolof, and many others.
Wow.
So Africans always resisted. Those who remain on the continent always resisted, and fought against the aggression from the Western companies, the Western powers, the French, the British, the Portuguese, mostly. Also here in the Western Hemisphere, resistance was permanent. People resisted physically, people resisted with other means that did not involve any kind of violence. Maybe the most, let's say the most frequent, or let's say the most obvious and frequently used by enslaved people was running away, becoming a maroon. That's why saying no to your master. You go out into the swamp, the woods, mountains, and make sure they don't recapture you.
Wow.
They recapture you, you are in big trouble. Like if you read the French Black Code that was promulgated here in Louisiana in 1724, you ran away for the first time, your punishment would be to be branded on one shoulder with the fleur-de-lis, and then they cut your ears.
Wow.
It becomes your identity. You'll be even hard to sell, but discipline has a price. Slave control has a price. You mutilate some, you kill some in order to control the majority. You run away a second time, they burn the other shoulder with fleur-de-lis, and then they cut your hamstring. If you run away a third time, It was the death penalty. It was a lot of pain inflicted to the flesh of these people in order to tame them. But you know, the flesh can be tamed. You may surrender, but it doesn't mean that the resistance is over. You keep resisting if your culture. That's what we call cultural resistance or passive resistance. That's when you talk to your master. You don't open your mouth. You just talk to yourself. Okay, you own my flesh, but you cannot own my soul. I will hold on to my music, to my foodways. I will hold on to my folk tales. And above all, I will hold on to my religion. You cannot do anything to my soul. Yeah. But also people went into rebellions. Here in the United States, maybe the two. The most famous cases is on the East Coast, in the Stonewall Rebellion. I think it was South Carolina. You have Nat Turner in Virginia, I think. But the largest slave revolt ever, and which many Americans don't know about, is that the one that erupted here in Louisiana, on the German coast of Louisiana. Somewhere between St. James and St. John the Baptist Parish, St. Charles Parish, into New Orleans. January 1811, when hundreds of people who were enslaved on the German coast decided to march down river to capture New Orleans. They had firearms, horses. The goal was to capture New Orleans, free all the enslaved people, and maybe find a way to a free country. Or maybe try to start a free, let's say a free country here. It was more difficult. But anyway, they were defeated. They did not fulfill any of their goals, and they had to pay the price of failure. They were taken before tribunals, courthouse. They were taken to trial before tribunals composed of slave owners. Dozens of them were condemned to death. Then carried to the plantation where they belong, and in front of everybody, men, women, and children, they were executed and then beheaded, and the heads were posted on poles.
Oh.
I call that la pedagogy de la terror. That's the pedagogy of fear. That's terrorism. And but that didn't stop people from resisting until the Civil War erupted. When the Civil War started, they had thousands of people who were in the swamp, in the woods, who were maroons.
Yeah.
And most of them joined forces with the Union. Okay, so these are things of the past, but we need to talk about them because so many people suffered from it. And we know where the wealth went.
Right.
It did not go to Africans. It went to Europe. Most of the beautiful cities were built on the back of Africans and African Americans. And at the end of slavery, they just closed upon the gate and told those people, you're free. What is freedom without economic support? What is freedom without the basic civil rights? In fact, everywhere in the Western Hemisphere, people were literally re-enslaved. They do not call it slavery, but they gave it other names. Jim Crow was worse than slavery. Reparations were never done after all these many years of slavery. African Americans were never granted real reparations. And you see the result today. The poverty, the violence, drugs, all this is related, mass incarceration, the bad schools, and today you see black people being shot like game in the streets of America. All that is related to slavery. And I think it is still time to do reparations for African Americans. Unfortunately, when you say reparation, people don't think about money immediately. Money comes last. Money is not what is lacking here. You have plenty of money. The problem is to have enough people who are willing to do something and correct the error of the past and address the legacies of slavery. But unfortunately, we have a real problem of education here. We have a lot of hidden history. And history is an excellent tool for us to understand the past. History, like I used to tell you, before the class where you enrolled, that history is not a courtroom or tribunal. The historian, the role of the historian is not to judge, to blame or no. That's not the role of the historians. The role of the historian is to uncover the past, allow people to understand the problems that needed to be fixed. If you don't understand the problem, how can you fix it? If people don't know the problem and understand it, how can you convince people to do something about the legacies of the past? That's what we are doing. That's what I've always been doing for many years now. And I think Whitney Plantation is also a good thing that was badly needed, a real museum of slavery.
Right.
Where people can go and get that spark,
Yeah.
By the time you stay there for about 2 hours, you will get something that will allow you to be willing to do something, to get more education about slavery. You have so many talented historians in this country. Maybe the highest concentration ever of historians of slavery especially.
Okay.
But the people don't get that knowledge. There's not much that go into the textbooks. Sometimes they write textbooks that are so funny. Some trying to justify slavery or to undermine the impact of slavery. You cannot do that. That's a waste of time. We have a proverb in my country, and you know it, you understand well of the proverb says, truth is like fire. Truth is like fire.
Is this Doug Kanye?
I
don't know. I think I said truth is like a spice. Maybe it's different. Sorry. Do your.
Yeah, this one said truth is like fire. Someone may sit on it, but not for too long.
Okay.
Yeah. Truth is just like fire. You may decide to sit on it, not allow people to know about it, but sooner or later you will jump.
Wow. Yeah. Well, Dr. Seck, I really appreciate you taking the time. Especially, it's exciting we have to be here together.
Yeah.
In New Orleans. The first time I met you, you were giving us a tour of Saint Louis, Senegal.
Saint Louis, yeah.
St. Louis, Senegal, and so St. Louis. There's one in Missouri. There's one in Senegal, and I was walking around the streets, and I just thought, this reminds me of New Orleans.
Yeah, Saint Louis is the base from which they built all these cities. Saint Louis, Senegal is older than Saint Louis, Missouri, older than New Orleans.
Yeah.
And if you look at the architecture you have here in, like in Louisiana, I don't know much about Saint Louis, Missouri, but the architecture here, the culture, the food, there are so many things.
Yeah.
That connect Saint Louis and New Orleans, just to give you that example. Yep. Saint Louis, Senegal was the base of the French colonization in the Western Hemisphere and also in Africa. Saint Louis is maybe the most important city in the French Empire is Saint-Louis in Senegal.
Wow, okay.
Unfortunately, the city is being eaten by the ocean. Yeah. It is not only a matter of climate change, but also we have aggression against the nature. I don't know if you know, along the Barbary, when we went to Saint Louis, when you go on the fishermen's area by the ocean, you know, when you go through the island of Saint Louis, and then you have that strip of land they call along the Barbary that protects Saint Louis from the ocean.
Yeah, I remember crossing a bridge.
Yeah, they had a big flood years ago, and they had the bad idea to cut that strip of land.
Wow, okay.
Now the ocean is just eating the city.
Oh.
I hope they will be able to fix it.
Yeah.
I doubt it.